I was looking for a way to kind of get my legs back under me. I was realizing that as I was getting into higher mileage.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 16 of Grit and Grace. I'm here with the legend himself, Sean Foster. He's the founder and owner of PLUNJ, which I go to every single day, and people that follow me know that I love PLUNJ. So thanks for coming on.
Oh no, man! It's I'm glad to be here. Glad we were able to meet up in the sauna, just a few weeks back.
Literally, and I was literally sitting there. And I was like, "This is the founder," because I always met Lena and his husband and her husband. I've always talked to them, but I've never got to see you. So if you want to just introduce yourself, just where you're from, just in general.
Sure. Yeah. So again, Sean Foster. I grew up in the southern part of Utah, Beaver, Utah. I grew up there, met my wife actually at EFY, kind of a funny story.
Oh, no way. I never knew this.
Yeah. And we ended up, becoming close, and I went on a mission to Honduras. We came back and we started dating, a lot more seriously. Moved up to Ogden for a little while I was doing my first part of school at BYU. She was finishing up at Weber State. Then we moved up to Seattle for a little while, where I did an internship in marketing with, a Microsoft kind of reseller up there for a little while. I came back down here to BYU, finished up my degree in advertising at the BYU Ad Lab. And then my wife didn't really want to have much to do with Provo, but as soon as we moved down here, she was the one that made me stay. So
really? Interesting.
Ever since then,
Where's your wife from?
We've called Provo home. She's from Davis County, so she grew up in Farmington, kind of right near Lagoon. Okay. She always had I don't know why, but she never really liked Utah County and Provo in general. Yeah. But now we've been here over 10 years now, and we call it home.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah. That's awesome. If you want to, can you just describe, I guess you can probably do it better than I can, but just what PLUNJ is. For those that don't know, I think people kind of get, even when I talk about it, like, oh yeah, I like the cold plunge and sauna. They're like, okay, like where do you like, and then I talk about it, and then a lot of people do now know what PLUNJ is, but just maybe give a brief description.
Yeah, so PLUNJ is a contrast therapy studio, right? And it's contrast therapy, in its simplest form, is basically the utilization of hot and cold therapy for your body. There's a lot of different ways that people utilize it. People will take a cold shower and a hot shower, right? That's contrast therapy in reality. There's cryotherapy, there's infrared sauna. There are so many different modalities of which people will utilize contrast therapy. What we decided to do with PLUNJ is we decided to kind of take it more towards a Nordic approach and use traditional sauna, right? Traditional dry sauna that they use kind of in the Nordic and Scandinavian countries, and cold plunge. And that's kind of in essence what contrast therapy is. Yeah,
for sure. What, like, I always think, like, because there had to be, do you feel like the idea came more from you, from your wife? What was kind of the lead up? So you did advertising, graduate from BYU. What was the lead up of being like, let's try, because the first location is the one here, right, in Provo?
Yep, the first location is here in Provo. It's kind of funny. So really what led up to that is I had worked in advertising for 6 or 7 years, doing project management and account management, mainly with influencer advertising, which I really loved. I felt like it was time to get out of that arena and into something different, so I got into software. And I was doing project management at a few different software companies, which, again, the companies that I was working for were great. But I just felt like, since high school, I've always been trying to think of, what I wanted to do for my business. And I felt like I've always had kind of, a small entrepreneurial mindset. And it's interesting because, probably for, 10 or 15 years, I've been bugging my wife about all of these different business ideas, most of which were pretty terrible.
Really? Like, what were some examples? I'm always curious, like, because sometimes I think I have business ideas, and I'm like, ooh, but I just not. Like, what were...
Oh, man. So, where to start? it was so funny. Like I said, I served my mission in Honduras, and they had these bags of water, and for some reason in my brain, I was like, hey, like bags of water, like for some reason, like that makes sense, and it's like, and it'd be cheaper to transport. And I had this whole idea. It was a terrible idea. I had, a lot of ideas around different ad agencies that I wanted to start that were kind of spin-offs of different things that I was doing in the ad world. I meant too many, little products to mention. And I still have, a ton of little ideas in my brain. And even recently, Lauren's like, no, Sean, like just focus on one for right now. Let's just focus. So I think it's kind of part of my ADD brain.
You're just all over.
It keeps a lot of tabs open in my brain at all times. But no, so as I was working in those professions. I was also training for some ultra marathons and some trail marathons. That's one of my passions. And as I was training for those, I was looking for a way to kind of get my legs back under me. I was realizing that as I was getting into higher mileage, it was harder and harder for me to get my legs back under me and keep training and keep going where I wanted to go with my training. So I remember, in high school, we would sit in ice baths after football practice, and I'm like, I wonder if that will help at all. So I went down to the Provo River and I started sitting in the Provo River, pretty often, a few times a week after my runs. And it was about a few months after that my wife just, kind of at dinner time at one point, she was just like, hey, like, have you noticed that like your stress and anxiety and, some of that stuff hasn't been as much of as an issue the last few months? And it was interesting because I just started like a new job that was, my responsibilities were pretty heavy with that new job, and everything pointed to the fact that I should have been feeling all of those feelings like really strongly, but it just didn't hit me in the same way that it had in the past. Anxiety and stress and things like that have been, and panic attacks, those have been things that I've dealt with ever since I was a kid in high school. Never really knew what it was until later in life. I feel like, the conversation surrounding stress and anxiety and that sort of thing has become, a much broader topic.
Yeah.
But yeah, all of a sudden I was coping with a lot of that a lot better. And really,
did you realize like in a conscious sense that it was working, or did you needed like your wife to be like, hey, I'm noticing a difference, and then you kind of realized that you were noticing a difference?
It was honestly her bringing it up that made me first realize like, oh man, like that's true. It's been a while since I've had any of those, those major breakdowns or anything like that. And, one thing led to another, and I was like, really, the only thing that has changed, like my diet hasn't changed a lot, my workout routine hasn't changed a lot, and I'd always used my workouts as a way to kind of cope with that. But, as I started to think about it, I'm like, well, I've been sitting in the river pretty often, and, I started looking into that, and sure enough, the cold water, definitely helps with a lot of that through, releasing different chemicals into the body, into the bloodstream, and so I was like, this is really interesting. So I kind of went down, a deeper rabbit hole and looking into it and kind of trying to figure it out. I started sitting in the cold.
And at this time you weren't sauna. You weren't in the sauna. It was
wasn't
just
in
cold,
the sauna, just cold. And it was interesting because I was actually running one of those races I was training for, and I was down in Moab, and I was listening to a book called The Finnish Way. It's a book that specifically talks about the Finns in Finland.
Oh, it's the one in the... Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay.
Yeah. And as I was reading that, they started talking about, because it was funny, I like went on to Amazon and like started searching up books for cold plunge, and that was one of the ones that cropped up, and so started listening to it, and a good portion of the book is about this woman's desire to kind of go back to her ancestral home of Finland and figure out why they're always rated as some of the happiest people.
Happiest people, yeah.
Even though they live in an extremely cold, dark for most of the year place that you don't think that would kind of breed that kind of people. But a large portion of the book was talking about sauna and winter swimming. And it kind of piqued my interest, and I had my wife read it, and so she started reading it. And in the back of my brain, I was thinking like, man, this needs to be more accessible. This needs to be something that a lot of people can utilize, because in reality at that point, this was back in like 2018, 2019, the only place that you could go and utilize it in a studio atmosphere like Plunge is. I should have mentioned that when we
Was
were
it
talking about.
2018 that you started Plunge?
No, it was actually 2021.
Oh, I thought you said that. I was like 20. I was like, I could have sworn it was not that long ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and the only place from a studio perspective that you could go do that was, paying like $200 or $300 for a massage at the Stein Eriksen Lodge, and then you get access to their sauna and cold plunge.
They have a cold plunge there.
Yeah, they do.
Where is that lodge?
It's up in Park City.
You would never know. Like I would have never. Even like searching up.
No.
Like when you search up cold plunge on Google right now, that doesn't pop up.
No,
so
not at all. It's like they kind of use it as kind of a nice little added feature of everything else.
It's not
they
the
sell in their
feature; it's an
spot.
added feature. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in the back of my mind, I was kind of like, hey, this would be kind of cool to try and start a business. But as I said, I feel like I'm always peppering my wife with all of these, crazy business ideas. And after she got done reading it, we were on our drive because she also works up in tech up in Lehigh, and we were on our commute up there. And she just turns to me and she's like, Sean, I think we should like turn this into a business. And I was like, okay, if she's the one coming to me with a business idea,
yes.
like let's try and make this happen. So one thing led to another, and right at the end of 2019, we felt like we were getting ready to pull the trigger, and so I kind of put in, like a 2 months notice at my job saying, hey, like after I finish up with these projects, I want to pull away. This is what I'm planning on doing. It was right about then, though, right after, like literally a week before like my end date, COVID hit.
Oh yes, this was the COVID time.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that we were pretty bummed because we were literally like a week or two away from signing on a different location than we have now, kind of down near Provo Center Street. We really liked the location. But with COVID hitting, we decided to pull back. We decided to kind of take that time and kind of try and really dial in what it is we wanted to offer. And it was a bummer, but at the same time, we were really glad for that time because it helped us hone in exactly what we wanted to offer. Early on, we wanted to offer everything from massage and have a big group space for yoga and stretching. And
you wanted a whole center almost. Yeah.
Like which would be awesome in all reality. But as we started, really dialing into it, we decided we wanted to go more the approach of like in and out and have a very small offering that's very niche that we can try and do the very best. Because in reality, I don't know a lot about massage. I don't know a lot about yoga.
It's hard to. It was probably overwhelming to try to think you had to dip into all these wells that you already were just learning about cold plunging and sauna. Now you got to dip into yoga. And, yeah.
And also, it allowed us to really collaborate with everybody here in the area. There's a lot of really solid yoga studios already doing a great job. There's a lot of, private contract massage therapists that come to Plunge often, and we've been able to share business with them. So it's been really collaborative in that standpoint. And I'm really glad that's kind of, the direction we decided to head. But, fast forward to 2021, that's when we actually got our doors open. It was June of 2021 that we got our doors open in Plunge Provo officially. So.
And then so Plunge Provo started 21, and then I remember I started coming. Well, I wasn't an OG. Who is the guy that is an OG? He was in the class earlier. He picks up shifts on occasion.
Oh, Alex.
Yeah, Alex. Yeah. So I started coming 2023, and so it's interesting. So you had Provo, and then I was there in 2020, 2022, 2020, 2023. That's when I started going. It was 2 years ago. Yeah, 2023. And at that time, it was only Provo Plunge. It was like that was the only thing to go to was there.
Yeah.
When did you kind of realize within starting Provo Plunge that you could start to expand? When was kind of like the realization that this is actually doing better than we thought? Was it hard at first? Like, did it work at first, or do you have doubts? Like, what was that like?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this because I think every person that wants to start a business has, the hopes and dreams of the end sight, of everything that could come from the business first. And, I don't think and you usually see, and you usually talk to people who have started businesses that things have gone well, right? It's just kind of the nature of, you get to know those people because their business is still up and going and it's doing well. But man, those first few months were some of the most difficult and most challenging of my entire life. It was so interesting because contrast therapy and cold plunge and sauna had become such a passion and such a...
You kind of just dove into that world.
Yeah, and such a... such a remedy for me personally, both physically and mentally, that then to kind of turn it into my business, it was really jarring because all of a sudden this thing that I cared so much about was my biggest stress. And the thing that usually was my stress reliever was now my stressor.
Wow, yeah.
And so it was a really interesting, the first few months of PLUNJ, getting up and running was really difficult. Not only because, when we first started PLUNJ, the way that PLUNJ looks now in Provo is completely different than the first version of PLUNJ. We used to have two small.
I remember I was there when
plunges.
it wasn't yet too. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the sauna looked different, and we made a lot of design choices that were great, but from an aesthetic standpoint, but didn't function the right way, and so having people in there was really difficult, especially when we started to get busy, and it was just, there was so much to learn, and it was so overwhelming. And
talk about panic attacks.
No,
probably.
it's for real. Like, I don't think I tell people this, that there were a few times where I literally could not step foot inside of PLUNJ without like getting a panic attack.
Wow.
And I tell people all the time that, they always ask about my wife Lauren's involvement in PLUNJ and how, involved she is on a regular basis, because she still has her own full-time tech job.
Mm-hmm.
But like without her in those first 3 months, like PLUNJ wouldn't exist, because there were a lot of times I couldn't even be inside of PLUNJ because
so triggering. It just triggered so many feelings and emotions.
Exactly. And it was kind of hard to understand and, work through. And so it took some time. But, I think with people, entrepreneurs in general, I think they forget that, there's a really important piece of that self-care and understanding, what your limits are and how to push and when to push is really important. And then also making sure you have a really solid support, structure beneath you that can help you and, that can really take, the load in a lot of ways. So, I'm kind of glad you brought that up, because that was a really big portion of like the whole PLUNJ journey for me. Was those first 3 months. And it was interesting because, the first 3 months were pretty difficult.
Was it just difficult in a sense of you guys didn't feel like it was going to work, or you did or you weren't making money, or was it just difficult, just everything, logistics, money, just the whole 9 yards?
I mean, everything, because, we had basically mortgaged our house to build the first version of PLUNJ. So there was a lot riding on PLUNJ working at that point. You
quit your job.
Yeah, I quit my job, and we had mortgaged our house. So I'm like, crap. Like, what did I do to my family's future? What if this doesn't work out?
You're like questioning everything. Yeah.
And like the first few months, it's kind of hard because you're open for so many hours, and you get like one person, maybe two people, and they like trickling in. And you have a lot of time to think about the worst case scenario in that situation, especially when you're at the space. During some of those longer days where you're like, well, I'm not going to hire an employee to sit here for 10 hours a day. Yep. But little by little, we started to see more people, trickle in. And the wonderful thing about PLUNJ is that it's, rarely does somebody come to PLUNJ for their first time alone, right? There's like a really big referral, basis to the way that our business operates and runs. People like to be there with people that they know, and people like to bring people that they care about and want to do it with. So that, was always a really good thing, because we started to see more and more people come in together, and then all of a sudden it started to snowball. And it was about 3 months we broke even on like a cash flow perspective. And then from there to about 6 months is when we started to kind of realize like, hey, like this, like we're, making.
This was 6 months after, or about?
6 months after
you start opened.
Yeah, and
so it was dark 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
And then the next couple months got a little bit better, and then.
Yeah, and I honestly consider myself really lucky in that standpoint, right? Like, because PLUNJ ended up, gaining traction a lot quicker than other businesses do, but the lead up to that point was tough, but we learned so much from it, and we're able to come out the other side. And then it was about, I think it was about a little over a year in when I was introduced to my current partner. And him and I actually got introduced by his son who had come in, pretty early on in the business, and he actually works with us now and is one of our partners in the business as a whole as well. But, I got introduced to them. They had the idea of wanting to do something very similar up in Park City. And after chatting, we realized that we were very much on the same page of what we wanted to see from the business as a whole. So, we decided to take them on as partners, which has been honestly one of the best decisions.
And they're partners for the whole corporation.
Yeah, so we basically broke out.
They're not just franchise owners; they're actually partners.
We actually broke it off into two separate entities. We have, just PLUNJ locations, and then we have PLUNJ corporate. PLUNJ franchise is what we call it. And so, our idea behind that was to start franchising the model and start bringing people on to open their own locations.
Wow. How did you figure out that was like the right financial move? Did you have was it your business partner that helped you realize, oh, this could be smart doing a franchise model? Or did you have like people that are maybe more smart than you in that field of finance? Or did you feel like you could figure out the numbers and could figure out, because me thinking about that, I'm like, I don't even know how that, I wouldn't even know. I would just be so thrilled on PLUNJ, but to make that next step is kind of a little bit scary, maybe a little. Because you did it with one and you had all that stress, and now it's like, okay, well, we're gonna do it with more, and we're gonna open more and give it to more people. So
well, it's interesting because there are so many little pieces to that we opened up the first location, and for me personally, I was like, honestly, if we can break even on this thing and have it be a part of the community, I'm going to be happy. I want access to this myself, and I want other people to have access to
creating a community.
That's where the first goal started, right? And I feel like you'll talk to so many business owners, and I'm sure that this is kind of a common thread with people you talk to, but every business owner has these little finish lines that they create for themselves, and it always keeps moving.
It keeps moving. Yeah.
There's never like a defined finish line, which I think is really interesting. But we. Bringing on my partner, he owns a portfolio of like 20 plus hotels within Marriott, Hilton, IHG.
Oh, wow.
So he had a really solid understanding of what it was like to be a franchisee. And, we leaned on that pretty heavily. He also, comes from a law background. So he had a lot of, expertise in that area, which I simply don't have, which was really nice. And so he was able to kind of, give us a really good understanding of what we needed to expect from that standpoint. His wife was also a very successful businesswoman in her own right. So she has a lot of experience that she brought into the table that way. Funny enough though, even before we started PLUNJ, I was over across the street helping my neighbor. Just like there was a big windstorm and he was cleaning up a tree in his front yard. So I went over and I was helping him. He's a good friend of mine. I was telling him about what we wanted to do with PLUNJ. He just so happens to own a franchise design and interiors business that he runs and has run for 20 plus years. And he's like,
welcome to Utah.
I know, right?
Everyone you talk to, oh, you own a business? Oh, cool. Oh, you own a business? Oh, cool. You've done that for 20 years? I didn't know you did that. Yeah, it's so funny. Yeah.
And it's crazy because it was only like 2 weeks before that I had actually went and like toured his space for the first time, and got to understand what he was doing. Like, in reality, I kind of always understood. But he was like, well, dude, let me help you start up this first location, then it'll be good for me, because if, you decide that one day you do want to franchise, we're going to have all this ready for you, like a playbook that's ready to go. And your location is going to have a really cohesive design from the start. So I was like, well, that makes a lot of sense. So in the back of my mind, the franchising was always kind of there. But I'm like you in that from a finance perspective, I've had to learn a lot more on that, and I've gotten better at it, but it's still not something that I consider myself a professional at. And that's one of the things that I've learned, probably more than anything starting a business, is that you have to have people that are smarter than you in every single category. And you can't ever really feel like that you have a handle on everything, because in reality you don't. There's always going to be somebody that has a better idea, that always is a little bit smarter. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to franchise, is we knew there's a lot of people out there that could make PLUNJ the best that it possibly could be. Not to say we have very strict rules and regulations around our franchising.
I was going to ask you about that, like the branding that you want to create. Obviously you don't want each franchisee to create a new plunge out of nowhere and have their own brand. What are the kind of, and did that guy that you met across the street, was he the one that helped you brand Plunge, like the designing of like the logo, not just the logo but the overall, like, you know, what, like almost what people think of when they see your Instagram, or what they think of, like, you know, was he involved in that?
So it's interesting coming from the advertising world. I've always been in love with branding, right? That was one of the main reasons.
Oh yeah, of course, you're an advertiser. Yeah,
that was one of the main things that drew me towards advertising in the first place. I would, you know, sit there and look over creative arts magazines, and like, even to this day, I love football, but I will watch the Super Bowl for the ads more than I will the game.
Yeah.
Right. And so from the get-go, that was one of the most interesting parts of building Plunge, was to build the brand. And so a lot of like the logos and a lot of the you know, the brand guide and things like that, that was something that, you know, I was able to create. But then when I took it to Wadsworth, that's the company, the design company, they were able to really flesh that out and put it into a physical space. They took my logos that I created, they took my color schemes, they took the ideas that I had around Scandinavian design, and they were able to put it into practice, which I was really grateful for, because I had a little bit of an understanding, but they were actually able to like bring it to life, which fruition, was honestly one of the biggest wins of bringing them on, is that they were able to do that so much more efficiently than I feel like I could have on my own.
Were they there right from the get-go?
Yeah,
right from the start. And
and they, you know, they've been a really, you know, kind of pivotal partner as we've moved into these other locations, because now as a franchisee comes on, we introduce them to Wadsworth. They're able to go through, you know, get a design in hand that matches a lot of what our needs are, you know, and make sure that it matches what our design aesthetic is.
Yeah.
So now when you go into Saratoga Springs, or you go into Kaysville, or you go into Idaho Falls, they all have a very similar aesthetic to even what you see in Provo, even though Provo is version 1. And it makes
Is Provo version 1, would you say that's kind of the sample for everything else?
Yeah.
Like if everything else can be like somewhat of Provo, then everything will be. Is that how you feel about Provo? It's kind of like the OG, or? Yeah,
it was definitely our MVP, right? Like, it was us trying to determine exactly what's going to work and what isn't going to work. I tell people all the time, the amount of what we like to call dumb tax that we paid in Provo was so substantial but then it makes every single location after that so much better, because we realize, like, hey, no, you need drains right here and right here and right here. The way you build the sauna,
it was kind of like you had to make mistakes through Provo really to learn and then figure out everything.
Yeah. I feel like that's one of the interesting things about Plunge, is you walk in and you see kind of what the business is, and kind of the simplicity behind the organization of the business. But you really don't see all the complexity that comes with that, with, you know, hundreds of people every single day, with a whole bunch of water and a space that's just like a regular retail space, making sure you build that out right with the right kinds of equipment. It's been a really long process, and it's still ongoing. You know, we're still trying to, you know, dial in exactly how we want our cold plunge pools to function the very best that they can, and, you know, really dial in the design of these new locations that are coming in, and, you know, trying different ideas on every single one of those. So it's definitely an iterative process, but we feel like, you know, where we'll be at the end of this year with the amount of locations we'll have open will be a really exciting prospect for all of the franchisees coming in at that point, because things will be so much more dialed in.
I think we were talking about this. It's like temple announcements. It's like the announcements. So you told me this in the sauna the other day. What are the active locations, and then what are the locations that are either being built or have been announced that are going to happen?
Yeah, so the ones that are open are Idaho Falls, Saratoga Springs, Kaysville, and Provo. Those are the current active and open locations. Apart from that, I think by April, Boise, Draper, Salt Lake, Park City, and St. George will all be open. They're really heavy into construction. Most of them are putting walls up right now.
Whoa, yeah.
So there's things are moving really quickly on that front. So we're really excited to get all those locations up and running. Some of them, like Park City, have been in the works for a really long time. So we're really excited to start to see those come to fruition.
I feel like Park City is like the perfect place for it. I
Oh,
feel like that's like maybe
gonna be amazing.
if you think about the location, Park City might be the best location in my opinion. I'm
Yeah.
like thinking about that. That's like perfect. All the skiing,
Yeah.
a lot of wealthy people, celebrities. Like people are just yeah. I feel like that's
Well, it's cool. The space that they bought, they have these amazing views just out towards the mountains that nobody has built behind them yet, and so they have these views that are going to be in the sauna and in the like the rest area and from the cold plunge, that are going to be awesome. I'm really excited for that location, and being up there this last week, during Sundance, it's going to be really cool next year to see who we can get to come into plunge.
Well, I'm telling you, there's gonna
Sundance.
there's gonna be. Did you ever? Or there's gonna be a lot of, I think, famous people that come through that location. Did you ever? I have so many questions going through my head, but did you
No,
did
you're
you
good.
ever feel like? Did you go into plunge knowing? Because in my opinion, what from an outside perspective, my opinion is that plunge's greatest asset is the community and the people that's created from it. And then there's also like, it's like that's almost the product that people don't even realize that that's the product. They obviously love the plunge, they love the sauna, but the reason I like our work headquarters, we have a cold plunge, we have a sauna where our headquarters is, and I don't go there. I still go to plunge, and I one day was thinking about why do I do that? Why do I choose? It's 15-minute drive from my house, the plunge, whereas in the sauna at my work is like 4 or 5 minutes. And still I choose to go to plunge, and I think it's, in my opinion, that's the greatest asset of the company. What is your thoughts on, did you expect that to be such a big reason why you keep loyal customers or why people love it? Or like...
It's interesting how things morph within a business,
Uh-huh.
because as I was talking to a lot of my mentors, as we were starting Plunge Up, and I was going over like different pricing strategies and marketing models and all like the different stuff, the one thing that most all of them would call out would be, hey, like, are you sure you want this to be communal? And mainly because, Provo's and Utah in general is a little bit more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know if you're going to like want to go into a space in your bathing suit and sit next to somebody you don't know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, in reality, that's a very, it's obvious that, hey, that could be an issue.
Yeah.
But from the books that I had read and kind of what I had been exposed to, and the fact we kind of wanted to take the Scandinavian approach to this, like that community portion is a really big part of it.
So powerful.
Not to mention, as you start looking at it from, a financial forecasting, perspective, and you start to look at like your equipment costs and the amount of space that you need, it made sense for us to operate that way from a cost perspective.
Mm-hmm.
There's, one of our passes at Plunge is called the Lagom Pass,
Yep.
right? That is, a term that's used over in, Scandinavia, that it's a Swedish word that basically means not too much, not too little, kind of finding that right amount.
Yeah.
And that's a principle that we really adhere to and want to strive for at Plunges, because, we realize there's probably more that we could have, different ways that we could have done it, but kind of driving in and trying to find exactly what that perfect middle ground was,
Mm-hmm.
was something that was really important to us. And we just kept coming back to the fact that the best way for us to do this will be from a communal perspective. And it will allow us to run with, lower costs, and, it'll kind of allow us to kind of harken back to the roots that we're trying to kind of portray over here. To be clear, we're not super traditional in the way that we do things as opposed to how they do things over there, but it's kind of our take on that. But as we started to open, we realized that it was becoming such a big part of why people come.
Yep.
One of my favorite stories I tell about that is that I was in a session with, a bunch of CrossFit athletes that, and they were extremely gifted CrossFit athletes, and, mid-20s, very active.
Talk about community.
Yeah. And so they were in there together, and they were in the session with this 75-year-old woman who had been coming regularly for quite a while, especially at the very beginning. And they, were just kind of doing their own thing for the first part of the session. She goes out and starts to sit in the cold, and she was a pro in the cold, man. Like, she could hang in the cold for a while.
Yep.
And so she was just in there kind of hanging for a few minutes, and then the CrossFit athletes came in, and they were, kind of freaking out, get into the cold plunge. And they were talking to her like, oh my gosh, how are you doing this? And so they struck up a conversation. Well, like by the end of the session, they were already like planning their next session together, and they were chatting,
Wow.
and they were like talking to her about their relationship issues and like all
Uh-huh.
of this stuff that you would never, that would never be a topic of conversation anywhere
Uh-huh.
else. But for some reason, when you're doing those sorts of things with people in the sauna and in the cold plunge, it ends up turning into, something more. And people are usually more open.
It's weird. Yeah,
yeah,
it really is. You feel it's not even vulnerable. You just feel more. It's like a safe. It's like the most. Feel safe.
yeah,
Like I've never gone to plunge and felt this like uncomfortable, unsafe. And I've been with like, I mean, like your your demographic of customers is like
it's so wide.
you got like, I mean, I'm not political, but you could tell you walk in, you're like, oh, we got some Trump lovers. And then you could tell you got left wing, and you're like just like the most like religious, then the complete atheists,
Yeah,
very holistic to like, why am I here? But I'm
yeah.
loving this. Like you have like all of these. So it's such a cool. It's amazing what you've created, what you guys have created, and maybe you don't take credit enough, but I think the brand and just the culture and the vibes is like insane.
Oh, well, we appreciate that. I think, it's kind of equal parts, really trying to steward that into the business, but also getting lucky with really great people that come into Plunge, and I
Yeah.
think it's kind of equal parts, both of those things. And I think the people that enjoy Plunge are the kinds of people that help build that culture. There are a lot of people that come into Plunge and they enjoyed their first visit, but then they, maybe will come
It's like a
back
one
every
and
once
done.
in a
Yeah,
while.
yeah, yeah.
But the people who have, our memberships and the people that keep coming back and are so active in it, they are the ones that really drive that for us. And I think it's just that kind of person, which, we're really grateful for.
That's
But
so cool. That's awesome. I wanted to just ask you a few questions on like entrepreneurship and maybe some of the like misconceptions of entrepreneurship, and then maybe some of the things that you've really understood and realized. Maybe some key principles that if you could like teach anyone. Let's say you have a graduate from high school and he comes and he's like, I want to be an entrepreneur, but he doesn't know what. What would be some of the misconceptions that you would tell him about entrepreneurship, and then some of the things that you've learned about entrepreneurship, about being one?
yeah, I think, first off, there's, again, a lot of the times you hear on podcasts or you like, see people on TV or whatever, the entrepreneurs that are speaking have gone through the grind, and there's this kind of fantastical positioning of it all that makes you feel like, oh my gosh, like this would be a dream, right? Like I get to choose my schedule every single day and I get to do exactly what I want to do. And in reality, that's not true, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Not, I have partners, I have a wife that cares about the business, and I have, customers and other people that care about the business. And so, no, I don't get to do what I want, right? Like
Yeah.
it's very much a collaborative landscape, more so than, when you just have a job at a, bigger corporation.
Yeah.
There were jobs that I worked where I would, show up and I had so much autonomy that I could basically do what I wanted for months on end. And
Months
as long
on
as I was
end.
getting my stuff done, like
Yeah.
nobody asked any questions. That's not the case. As an entrepreneur, you're definitely under a microscope, and you answer to a lot of different people. And you answer to them in a much different way than you would just like a regular boss, right? You're answering to people that are using your place as a therapy. You're answering to people that it's a really important part of their lives, and so you have to make sure that you're careful with that. So that's like the first thing that I would say is that, while there is a lot of flexibility, and I absolutely love the flexibility of it, it comes with its trade-offs, just like everything. And so you have to kind of be aware of that. And there's a lot of housekeeping things that I don't think a lot of people realize. Just, I mean, the amount of taxes and regulations and, things.
So many logistical things.
Yeah, many little logistical things that you don't realize go into starting a business and running a business, and that take so much time in running a business. But it's not to say you can't get around them and find your groove, but those are all things that you definitely have to take into consideration as you're starting. And then, everybody knows that being an entrepreneur, definitely isn't easy. But, I think what I like to tell people is that if you're interested in doing something, there's nothing stopping you from starting small, right? There are so many little things that you can do to wrap your head around the complexities of owning a business with something so small. Something that that you spend literally hundreds of dollars on instead of, thousands and thousands of dollars on, which at least gets your toe dipped into the arena and allows you to kind of start building up an understanding of what needs to be done and when. So that's kind of another thing that I'd tell people is like, you don't have to like, start going all in and do something really large. Like there's so many different ways that you can look at starting a business that gives you a lot of the same experience and understanding without it, being such a massive deal.
Yeah. It's like taking mortgage and
Exactly.
giving up your job. Yeah, that's crazy. And talking about like mental health, especially, like for me, the only reason I went to Plunge was I had no relief with my OCD. I had there was nothing. No medications, no, therapy was working, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to give this a shot, this whole cold plunge thing. And immediately, like how maybe obviously you can relate, but immediately I could feel, I mean, obviously this isn't to say that cold plunge and sauna is going to heal your illnesses but the relief that you find is so observable. Like you can, there's some things that aren't noticed, and then there's things that you can notice. And like, that's like a noticeable thing with cold plunge and sauna. But what has that been like being a business owner, but with the anxieties that you have, with the things that you struggle mentally? What is that like? What's that look like?
So it's interesting because, like you said, I don't think we ever want to portray cold plunge as a fix-all, right?
Yeah.
Or contrast therapy in general as a fix-all. It's a great tool to have in your toolbox.
Yeah.
And it's going to work for you differently than it works for somebody else. And that's one of the things that we try and communicate more than anything to people coming into plunge is like, hey, you've probably heard it a million times. Listen to your body.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of studies that are coming out. There's a lot of science out there that, talks a lot about, the specifics behind why to do it and why it works in that way. But in reality, we want people to be more focused on how they feel before they come in and how they feel after and what the lingering effects are. And, it's so interesting to me because I always felt that the mental health portion of what plunge is would always kind of just be kind of in the background. And it
Really?
I always felt like this would be more for people who wanted to recover from whatever, or that they wanted to like recreate and have like a fun date idea. And that's like, we'll definitely get people that are interested in their mental health. But I had no idea that like a majority of the people that come in on a regular basis, that's what
it's more for mental.
Yeah, that's what they keep coming back in for, right? There's other, side effects that they like to come in for as well, but that reprieve from whatever it is one of those big one of the big reasons why people continue to come back to plunge. And it's so interesting how it operates for different people. Again, for a while it was really hard for me starting the business and like trying to use cold water, because it would almost, like, since it was, the business was such a stressor, it almost like put me into that situation of it being something that almost made my condition worse. And that's when I started, going back to the river, going back to the place where I first found a lot of my relief. And by going back there, I started to realize, that I could still utilize it in that way and have plunge take a very specific, role in that whole part of my life as well. But, it's been really humbling and really cool to talk with people and get their feedback on what contrast therapy in general has meant for their mental health. And it just makes me so happy, because that's like, that's really one of the biggest reasons why we wanted to try and get this up and running in the way we did, and just to hear so many people talk about how it's affected them and in what ways, it's been really cool.
That's so sick. That's awesome. Well, as far as why, I have a couple, like two more questions, but as far as your why for doing what you're doing, I always say, like, when your why is so deep, the how and the what just don't matter. And you're gonna do it even if it's hard. You're gonna figure out, because your why, you're aligned with your why. If you could, like, within a few phrases or sentences in like 1 minute, describe the why of why you're doing this now. What is it? Because it's evidently not money anymore. You're not doing it because I want to make a bag. Like,
Yeah.
it's like you have a deeper reason.
Oh.
What would you say?
For sure, and I feel like that continually changes.
Yeah,
right?
that's cool to even hear that too.
I think we talked about my why at the very beginning, and it was I saw this really cool thing happen for me, and I want to make it more accessible. And then, as then having worked a lot of the corporate jobs that I did, I realized, like, hey, I want something that I care about. I want something that is important to me and that I can give to other people and make it accessible for other people. Because I've always like teased with my wife that I'm like the worst salesman in the world. I'm not I don't love to sell, but that's basically what I do every day now, and talking to people who may potentially want franchises. And it's such a different thing when you care about it so deeply. When it has had such a big impact on your life and you can see it impacting so many important people around you, like, it's a lot easier to go out there and be like, no, like, this is something I believe in. This is something that, like, that I want you to know about. It makes a really big difference in your ability to kind of push, what it is you care about and what it is you want to do. So I think, my why now is a little bit different. It's quite a bit the same. I really just want this to be, a bigger thing throughout the country so that people have access to it in a really accessible way. Of course, I'm biased. I feel like that the way that PLUNJ, provides that is one of the best on the market. But, even if that ends up being that we go into a community and 3 or 4 others pop up that, people have access to, like, that's also furthering, what I consider to be my mission.
Exactly.
I don't think,
Which is such an abundant way of looking at it, instead of being scarce and be like, this is ours, like, stay away.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're just, yeah, it's going to happen, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I have so many good friends that are doing, business in the exact same field that, we have really good business relationships with, just here in the state of Utah, as well as out of the state. And, a lot of it feels like, oh, maybe we should be competitors. But in reality, like, if I'm able to keep my business operating, at a profit, and it's providing the service that I want to people, I don't mind if others are doing the same thing in the way that they feel is important and is allowing people to do what they need to do as well. So, I feel that both of those types of, looking at it in both of those ways, I think kind of helps us realize, what kind of business it is that we want to run and kind of how we want to grow over the next 5 to 10 years.
Wow. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing it. That's awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's so cool. It's cool. That's the coolest thing about talking to people like you, people that have had to pay their dues, because everyone talks about it. Sometimes people think it's just like, oh, this popped up out of nowhere. That's cool. Like, this just like they just started this. Now they're making money. There's so much more behind the scenes that people don't realize, and that, entrepreneurs, the level of, sacrifice and even just the fact that you couldn't step foot in your own location because it was so triggering is something that people don't see and they don't talk about. And so it's really cool. It's really admirable what you're doing. I think it's awesome.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I feel like too, it's, kind of going back to, things that you'd probably tell high schoolers about, in relation to starting a business, is that there are so many ways to go about doing the exact same thing, right? But kind of staying true to the way that you want to do it will, eventually kind of help you get through those points where you're having to pay your dues. to be clear too, and I think that it's really important people know too that as you're starting a business, you know, if you listen to like how I built this, right? They always talk about like, oh man, like I didn't take a salary for years, right? And you're like, oh, whatever. Like there has to be some way around that because how would you ever live that way? But if you're running a business that you're passionate about, like that's kind of almost secondary on your list of things, right?
You getting paid.
Yeah, and it's interesting because
it's crazy because the whole world, like most of the world, they think people do these things to get rich.
Yeah.
But that's
I feel like it's almost opposite sometimes. Is they're working for their passion and they're doing something that they love, and then all of a sudden, you know, they put so much time and care into it that they build something that people love, and they can kind of see that bleed through, and ends up becoming really valuable.
And they end up getting reimbursed. They just get reimbursed.
Yeah, exactly. Because you know, in reality, people look at where Plunge is at right now, and you know, we have a lot of locations that are opening. There's a lot of you know, really cool and interesting stuff happening, and you know, we are making money, but it's definitely, you know, people think that there's like this, that you know, we've already made it, but dude, like we have a vision beyond where we're at that we really want to execute on, and we have so much more to do. I tell people all the time that where we're at right now is all make believe, because we have all these people that want to do locations, but we have to get those locations up. We have to get people in like yourself that care about it and build a community. There's so many more steps that we have to get through in order to feel like, you know, that those locations have made it. And I feel like, again, that finish line's always going to change, but you got to be okay with that process, and you got to be, you know, kind of in for the ride. You know,
that's so cool. A lot of nuggets here. This is going to be great. This is going to be awesome. The last question I always ask everyone is the name of the podcast is Grit and Grace. It's like my two favorite words in the dictionary, and I always just ask everyone, what do they think of, or how would you describe grit and grace? What is that? What comes to your mind, or soul in the sense when you hear that?
Yeah. Well, grit, you know, it's funny. There's I'm sure you've seen it right above our cold plunge, and it's the name of another one of our membership passes is Sisu, right? And you're probably aware of what Sisu is and what it means, but one of the most closely translated words from what Sisu is to the people of Finland and what it kind of translates to here is an idea of grit. It's determination, it's perseverance, it's pushing through, it's understanding your limits, but then pushing through those limits. You know, there's so many things that go into that, and understanding those within yourself, I think, it really is what grit is, you know, and that's why that, you know, Sisu has been such an important piece of our business and the philosophy behind our business, because it's this difference between, you know, Lagom and finding, you know, middle ground of something that's just right, but then Sisu, which is, you know, that undercurrent of determination and willpower, and, you know, finding a place for those two things to live together and find balance. So that's kind of what I think of when I think of grit. Now, grace in general is, when I think of grace, I kind of goes back to our conversations on mental health and realizing and being okay with the fact, especially from an entrepreneurial perspective and in a personal perspective, that it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to realize when you might not be enough, because there's so many people around you that can pick up that slack for you, you know? And I feel like that you have to give yourself a lot of grace in starting a business and going through life, or else it'll just be way too hard to handle. You got to be okay with giving yourself that grace so that other people can step in and you know, be that support that you need, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. That's exactly how I would. And actually, speaking of Sisu, I'm actually planning on getting it tattooed somewhere.
I love that.
I love that. I think Sisu, the way it's described, especially in the plunge, above the Provo plunge, the way that's described is literally a better description of what I found of grit. I think Sisu is like, almost like there's like grit, and then there's Sisu that kind of just takes it a little bit a step almost further than that. And I think it's the most Beautiful principle. And I think when I think of plunge, I think of grit and grace. I think of like this, you experience a gritty nature, you experience maybe putting your body into uncomfortable, but the results are you feel this like abundant grace from doing it, which is like all
well,
connected.
and even just like the difference between the sauna and the cold plunge, right? Like in the sauna, you're relaxed. There's like this overall feeling of calm, and I feel like that can equate to a lot of that grace that you feel. And then the cold plunge sucks, no matter how long you do it. Like it's
not,
you know,
not
it sucks. It's not fun. And you've got to have a little bit of that grit and determination to kind of move through and get through that so that you can kind of see the resultant benefit. So
for sure.
Anyways.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again for coming on.
Anytime.
Yeah, that was awesome. And that's a wrap for this episode.